And our dereg efforts are also putting a lot of downward pressure on prices. And so I think the question is it going to continue? And I think that you're right to highlight shelter costs. And one of the metrics of shelter costs that I find most interesting is that they're going down pretty rapidly in places like California because everybody's leaving. And so when we look at the aggregate numbers, the fact that it's actually, even though they're high prices in California, it puts downward pressure on inflation because shelter costs are such a big share of inflation and everybody's leaving the state.
That was Director of the National Economics Council, Kevin Hassett, talking about why inflation in places like California is declining. And his explanation is that it's coming primarily from housing costs, and that's due to the fact that there are lots of people leaving the state of California. But as a fellow economist, I must ask the question, is what he's saying actually true? Do the data and the numbers behind his statement hold out? So first of all, let's look at inflation to see if the prices overall and for housing specifically are decreasing in California. Now, while we don't have a measurement of inflation in California overall, the Bureau of Labor Statistics actually records inflation and the CPI for different metro areas in California. So we can look at Los Angeles as well as San Francisco to determine how inflation is being affected. So when we look at the rate of inflation for both Los Angeles as well as San Francisco, what we find is that the rate of change for core CPI, which is the rate of inflation minus food and energy, which tend to be pretty volatile, that rate of change for Los Angeles year over year is 2.6%, and that rate of change for San Francisco is about 3.1%. Now, when we compare that to inflation, specifically for housing costs, we find that Los Angeles' rate of inflation for housing is 2.7%, while San Francisco's is 2.9%. This means that the prices for housing are not decreasing like Kevin Hassett says in California. In fact, in those two major metro areas, the rate of inflation for housing is increasing, and in the case of Los Angeles, it's increasing faster than the rate of inflation. It's important to note here that housing prices are not going down if the rate of inflation is still positive, right? The only way that we could say that housing prices are declining is if the rate of inflation was negative for housing. And across all of the metro areas, because I know I just mentioned LA and San Francisco, however, the CPI is also measured in cities like Riverside and San Bernardino, as well as in San Diego. Those rates of inflation for housing are all positive. Now, what I will say is we don't have data on rural areas, and that's because CPI only measures inflation in urban areas, and the PCE for inflation in California has not been measured since 2024. So I will admit that that is a blind spot in the data itself. However, Kevin Hassett also doesn't have access to that data either, as far as I'm concerned. Which brings me to my next point, and that is what Kevin Hassett claims is the cause for the supposed decline in housing prices, although that's not what the data are mentioning. Now, Kevin Hassett claims that a decline in the population, right, in California, right, people moving out of the state and going to other states is resulting in a decline in housing prices. Kevin Hassett is correct in that there are quite a few people that are leaving the state of California and moving to other places. What's interesting and a little ironic about all of this is that people are citing the high housing prices in the state of California as a reason for leaving. However, if we look at the population, right, of the state of California, we actually find that that population is pretty stable and in some cases growing slightly. And that's because in California specifically, there's been an increase in immigration from international places into the state of California. The reason that the population declines we have seen in California have increased over the last year is due to not an increase of people moving out of the state, but the fact that we have immigration laws right now that are limiting the international folks coming in to the state. So this idea that we're seeing this massive exodus from the state of California, which is reducing demand for housing and causing housing prices to decrease, is not true, in the sense that the population of California, due to net migration into the state from international places, is keeping the population relatively stable. In fact, I don't think the story around California and its housing prices has a lot to do with demand at all, right? The demand for housing declining. What I think is much more going on, and I think this is true all across the country, is we have a greatly exacerbated supply of housing to go around, which keeps the prices of housing high. My mutuals, Diva Sunglasses and Daryl Fayweather, can probably speak to this more than I can, but a lot of the reason why there are such high prices in the state of California and why prices aren't coming down have much more to do with a housing shortage of about 1 million to 3 million units, depending on the estimates, as well as a market frozen by high interest rates and locked-in property taxes. So to summarize, what Kevin Hassett's saying in this video across a wide variety of metrics doesn't hold water, given what we know about the housing market in California, about population changes in California, and inflation, both overall and with housing. And for now, that's all I got. As always, if you have any questions, let me know.